The Dark Web. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Jacob Grayson, a 22-year-old hacker with a knack for slipping into places he shouldn't be, stared at the lines of code streaming across his screen. The glow from his laptop was the only light in the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls of his cluttered apartment. His fingers danced across the keyboard, each stroke bringing him closer to what he sought, a hidden forum rumored to be the darkest corner of the internet. For weeks, Jacob had been chasing whispers, rumors of a secretive group operating in the depths of the dark web. This wasn't the usual assortment of black market vendors or cyber criminals. This was something different, something far more dangerous. The group was said to be pulling strings on a global scale, their influence stretching into governments, corporations, and even the media. After countless dead ends and false leads, Jacob's persistence had finally paid off. A cryptic message embedded in the code of an obscure website had led him here, to a hidden server buried deep within the layers of the dark web. The forum's login screen blinked at him, its stark simplicity masking the secrets it held. With a deep breath, Jacob entered the username and password he had painstakingly pieced together from various fragments scattered across the web. The screen went black for a moment before the forum loaded, revealing a list of discussion threads, each one more disturbing than the last. He scrolled through the topics, his heart racing as he realized the magnitude of what he had stumbled upon. This was no ordinary forum. The discussions here were about covert operations, secret alliances, and plans for world domination. It was a conspiracy theorist's worst nightmare, but Jacob knew this was real. As he clicked on a thread titled Operation Eclipse, the screen filled with detailed plans for a cyber attack that would cripple the financial systems of several major countries. The attackers were planning to plunge the world into chaos, and they had the resources to do it. Jacob's blood ran cold. He had uncovered something that could change the world, and now he was in too deep. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just a spectator anymore. If he could access this forum, others could trace him back to it. Suddenly, his laptop beeped, a notification that someone was trying to access his IP address. Panic surged through him. Someone knew he was here. He had to act fast. Jacob quickly encrypted his connection and shut down the forum, but not before copying the files on Operation Eclipse. He knew he needed to get out of his apartment, to a safer place where he could think. But as he grabbed his backpack and rushed out the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. Chapter 2. The Pursuit. Jacob's footsteps echoed down the dimly lit staircase of his apartment building. Each step felt heavier as the reality of his situation sank in. He had crossed a line and there was no going back. The files he had downloaded were a ticking time bomb, and he was the one holding the trigger. As he exited the building, the cool night air hit his face, doing little to calm his nerves. He pulled the hood of his sweatshirt over his head and kept his head low, blending into the shadows as he made his way down the street. Every passerby seemed like a potential threat. Every car that passed could be someone sent to track him down. He knew he couldn't stay in one place for long. Whoever was behind the forum would stop at nothing to silence him. He needed to find a safe house, somewhere off the grid where he could analyze the files and figure out his next move. But first he had to lose any potential tails. Jacob headed for the subway, knowing it was his best chance to disappear into the crowd. He bought a ticket with cash, avoiding the cameras as much as possible, and boarded the first train out of the station. The car was nearly empty, save for a few late-night commuters and a homeless man sleeping in the corner. He took a seat near the back, his eyes darting from passenger to passenger, searching for anything out of the ordinary. As the train rumbled to life and sped through the underground tunnels, Jacob's mind raced. He needed a plan and he needed it fast. Suddenly, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of him. "We know who you are, Jacob. You can't hide." His heart pounded in his chest. They had found him already. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He quickly shut off his phone and removed the battery, tossing it into the nearest trash can. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and Jacob bolted out the door before it fully opened. He weaved through the crowd, ducking into side streets and alleyways, always glancing over his shoulder. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that eyes were on him even now. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the entrance of an old rundown building, a safe house he had set up months ago just in case. He entered the code on the door and slipped inside, bolting the door behind him. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it had everything he needed: a secure computer, a bed, and enough supplies to last him a few days. Jacob wasted no time, immediately booting up the computer and transferring the files from his laptop. As the data loaded, Jacob took a moment to breathe. He knew he was only scratching the surface of something much larger than he had anticipated. The files contained not just details of Operation Eclipse, but also names, locations, and communications that pointed to a vast network of powerful individuals. Jacob realized that he was in possession of something that could either save or destroy the world. But first, he had to stay alive long enough to decide which it would be. Chapter 3. The Ally. Jacob stared at the screen, the data before him overwhelming in its complexity and scope. He knew he couldn't do this alone. The network he had uncovered was vast, with tendrils reaching into every aspect of global power structures. He needed help, someone who could navigate this dangerous world alongside him, someone he could trust. But trust was a rare commodity in Jacob's line of work. Most of the hackers he knew were either self-serving opportunists or too deep in their own worlds to be of any use. But there was one person, a ghost in the hacking community, who might be willing to help. She went by the alias Cipher, and her reputation was legendary. Known for her skills in cracking the most secure systems, Cipher was also fiercely independent, a lone wolf who had managed to stay out of the reach of law enforcement and criminal organizations alike. Jacob had only communicated with her once, years ago, when he was just starting out. Even then, she had made an impression, a brilliant mind, but with a cold edge that warned him to keep his distance. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Jacob knew that if anyone could help him unravel the conspiracy, it was Cipher. He just had to find her first. He accessed a secure chat room on the dark web, one frequented by elite hackers. Using an encrypted message, he put out a call for Cipher, attaching a small piece of the data he had uncovered as bait. It was a risky move. If the wrong people intercepted the message, it could lead them straight to him. But Jacob was out of options. Minutes passed like hours as he waited for a response. The chat room was eerily silent, the usual banter replaced by an ominous stillness. Jacob's nerves were frayed, his mind racing with scenarios of what could go wrong. Just as he was about to give up, a new message popped up. "You're in over your head, kid." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. It was Cipher. "I need your help," Jacob typed, trying to keep his tone neutral. There was a long pause before she responded. "Why should I?" Jacob hesitated. He knew Cipher valued her privacy and safety above all else. Offering her something in return might be the only way to secure her assistance. "Because if this data gets out, the world as we know it could end," Jacob replied, sending another encrypted file as proof. It was a risk, but one he had to take. Another pause. Then finally, "Where do we meet?" Jacob let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He quickly typed out an address, a nondescript cafe in a quiet part of the city. It was public enough to avoid suspicion, but secluded enough for a private conversation. "I'll be there in an hour," Cipher replied, and then the chat window closed. Jacob quickly gathered his things, securing the files on multiple encrypted drives before shutting down the computer. He left the safe house, careful to avoid any cameras or potential followers. The streets were quiet, the city seemingly oblivious to the impending danger. When he arrived at the cafe, he took a seat near the back, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. He didn't have to wait long. A woman with dark hair, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, walked in. Her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of the room before they landed on Jacob. She approached with a casual grace, sliding into the seat across from him. Without a word, she placed a small device on the table, a signal jammer to ensure their conversation remained private. "You've got 5 minutes, Cipher said, her voice low but commanding. "Convince me this is worth my time." Jacob wasted no words, pulling out one of the encrypted drives and placing it on the table. "This is just a fraction of what I found. It's part of something called Operation Eclipse. They're planning a global cyber attack that will bring down financial systems worldwide. I need your help to stop it." Cipher eyed the drive skeptically before picking it up and slipping it into her pocket. "And what makes you think we can stop them?" Jacob leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I've got something they don't, information on their key operatives, their plans, and their vulnerabilities. But I can't do this alone." For a moment, Cipher said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, her decision made. All right, kid. Let's see if we can save the world. Chapter 4. The Chase. The moment Cipher agreed to help, Jacob felt a weight lift off his shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. As they left the cafe, heading towards a safer location to analyze the data, Jacob's instincts screamed that they were being followed. He glanced over his shoulder, trying to be discreet. At first, nothing seemed out of place. People going about their business, cars passing by. But then he noticed a man in a dark coat, moving through the crowd with too much purpose, his eyes locked on them. Cipher, we've got company, Jacob muttered, his voice tense. Cipher didn't break stride, but her gaze flicked to a nearby storefront, catching the reflection of their pursuer in the glass. How many? She asked, her tone calm and measured. Just one that I can see, Jacob replied, though he had a sinking feeling there could be more. All right, follow my lead, Cipher said. Without another word, she veered off the main street, leading them into a maze of narrow alleys and backstreets. Jacob kept close, his heart pounding as they wove through the city's underbelly. Behind them, the footsteps grew louder, the pursuer gaining ground. Cipher quickened her pace, her eyes scanning for an escape route. They rounded a corner, only to find themselves at a dead end, a brick wall rising up in front of them. Not good, Jacob muttered, his mind racing for options. Cipher didn't hesitate. She grabbed Jacob by the arm and yanked him towards a rusty fire escape. Up, she ordered, already climbing the rickety ladder. Jacob followed, scrambling to keep up as the metal groaned under their weight. They reached the rooftop just as their pursuer rounded the corner below. Jacob peeked over the edge and saw the man hesitate, scanning the area before pulling out a phone. He was calling for backup. Time to move, Cipher said, already making her way across the rooftops. The city stretched out before them, a labyrinth of concrete and steel. Jacob followed her, adrenaline pumping as they leaped from one rooftop to the next. But the rooftops offered no sanctuary. As they reached the third building, Cipher pulled up short. A helicopter was hovering overhead, its spotlight sweeping across the rooftops. The sound of its rotors filled the air, drowning out the city's noise. They're serious, Jacob said, his voice tight with fear. Cipher scanned the area, her mind working quickly. We need to get off the rooftops. Now. She spotted an open window in the building across the street, a narrow alley separating them from their goal. Without a word, she sprinted towards the edge of the roof and jumped, clearing the gap with a grace that took Jacob by surprise. He hesitated, glancing at the drop below before steeling himself. With a deep breath, he ran and jumped, barely making it to the other side. He landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact as Cipher pulled him to his feet. They ducked through the window, finding themselves in an abandoned office space. Cipher quickly led them through the building, down a series of stairs and out into a back alley. For a moment, all was quiet. They had lost their pursuers, at least for now. We need to keep moving, Cipher said, already planning their next steps. They'll have more on the way. Jacob nodded, still catching his breath. Where to now? Cipher's eyes were hard, her expression unreadable. We go underground. It's time to disappear. As they vanished into the night, Jacob couldn't help but wonder if they were already too late. The conspiracy they were up against was powerful, and now it was hunting them. But with Cipher at his side, he had a fighting chance, however slim it might be. And he was determined to see this through no matter the cost. Chapter 5. The Underground Network. The entrance to the underground network was hidden beneath an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Jacob and Cipher moved quickly through the darkened streets, keeping to the shadows as they approached the rusted metal door. Cipher punched in a code on a keypad, and with a low hum, the door slid open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness. Welcome to the underground, Cipher said as they began their descent. The air grew cooler, the noise of the city above fading into an eerie silence. At the bottom of the stairs, they emerged into a labyrinth of tunnels, remnants of a forgotten era, now repurposed by those who operated outside the law. The walls were lined with cables and pipes, and the faint hum of electricity buzzed through the air. This was the underbelly of the dark web, a place where hackers, smugglers, and those with secrets to keep could operate without fear of surveillance. Jacob followed Cipher through the maze of tunnels, his senses on high alert. They passed through several security checkpoints, each one more sophisticated than the last, until they reached a large, reinforced door. Cipher placed her hand on a biometric scanner, and the door slid open with a hiss. Inside was a sprawling underground hub, filled with rows of computers, servers, and equipment that Jacob had only seen in his wildest dreams. A handful of people, hackers, engineers, and coders, were scattered throughout the room, working in silence, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. "This is the Nexus," Cipher explained. "It's one of the most secure locations on the dark web. No one can find us here unless we want them to." Jacob looked around in awe. The sheer scale of the operation was impressive, but it also reinforced the gravity of their situation. They were up against forces that had the power to plunge the world into chaos, and now they were hiding in the shadows trying to stay one step ahead. Cipher led him to a corner of the room where a large computer terminal was set up. "Let's see what we're dealing with," she said, gesturing for Jacob to sit. Jacob plugged in the encrypted drive and began transferring the files. As the data appeared on the screen, Cipher's expression grew darker. The files contained detailed plans for cyber attacks on financial institutions, power grids, and communication networks across multiple countries. It was a coordinated effort designed to cause maximum damage with minimal effort. "This is worse than I thought," Cipher muttered, scrolling through the data. "They're not just planning to disrupt the system, they're aiming to take it down completely. This isn't just a cyber attack, it's a digital apocalypse." Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. The magnitude of what they had uncovered was terrifying. If the attack succeeded, it would send the world spiraling into chaos. Governments would collapse, economies would crumble, and society as they knew it would cease to exist. "We need to warn someone," Jacob said, his voice tinged with desperation. "We need to get this information out there before it's too late." Cipher shook her head. "It's not that simple. If we go public with this, they'll come after us with everything they've got. We're talking about some of the most powerful people in the world. They won't just silence us, they'll erase us." "Then what do we do?" Jacob asked, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Cipher was silent for a moment, her mind racing as she considered their options. "We need leverage," she finally said. "Something that will force them to back off or at least give us a fighting chance." Jacob frowned. "Leverage? Like what?" Cipher turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Like their identities. If we can figure out who's behind this, we can use that information to our advantage. Expose them to the world, and they'll have no choice but to retreat." Jacob nodded, realizing the brilliance of the plan. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "Let's do it," he said, determination hardening his voice. Cipher got to work immediately, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she began sifting through the data, looking for any clue that might reveal the identities of the people behind the operation. Jacob joined her, his mind focused on the task at hand. Hours passed in tense silence as they dug deeper into the files, piecing together fragments of information, following leads that often led to dead ends. But slowly, a pattern began to emerge, a trail of digital breadcrumbs that pointed to a handful of key players. As they zeroed in on their targets, Cipher's expression grew grim. "These aren't just hackers or criminals," she said, her voice low. "These are people in positions of power, CEOs, politicians, military leaders. They've been planning this for years and they've covered their tracks well. But they made one mistake. They didn't count on us finding them." Jacob felt a surge of hope. They had names, locations, and evidence that could bring down the entire operation. But as they prepared to act, the ground beneath them suddenly shook and the lights flickered. "What the hell?" Jacob muttered, looking around in alarm. Cipher's eyes narrowed. "We've been found." Before Jacob could react, the door to the room burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in, their weapons trained on them. Cipher sprang into action, grabbing Jacob and pulling him towards a hidden exit at the back of the room. "Run!" she shouted, shoving him through the door just as bullets began to fly. They raced through the tunnels, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, fear driving him forward as they sprinted towards safety. But deep down he knew that they were running out of time. The conspiracy had found them, and now, it was a race against the clock to expose the truth before they were silenced for good. Chapter 6. The Last Stand. The tunnels seemed to stretch on forever, a twisting labyrinth of concrete and steel that offered no respite. Jacob and Cipher ran with everything they had, their footsteps pounding against the cold, hard ground. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, shouts, footsteps, and the ominous clatter of gunfire echoing through the underground. "They're closing in," Jacob shouted, glancing over his shoulder. His breath was ragged, fear and adrenaline driving him forward. Cipher didn't respond, her focus entirely on finding an escape route. They reached a junction in the tunnels, and without hesitation she turned left, leading them down a narrow passageway. The walls here were closer, the air colder, and the sense of dread heavier. As they ran, Cipher reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device, her fingers moving swiftly over its buttons. "I'm setting a trap," she explained between breaths. "If we're going down, we're taking them with us." Jacob's heart raced even faster. The thought of a final stand sent chills down his spine, but he knew they had no other choice. They had to make sure that the truth got out, no matter the cost. Finally, they reached a dead end, another metal door, this one old and rusted. Cipher quickly entered a code, and the door creaked open, revealing a small room filled with old equipment and wires. It was a relic of the past, forgotten by time but now their last hope. "Get in," Cipher ordered, pushing Jacob inside before sealing the door behind them. She then rushed to the computer terminal in the corner and began typing furiously. "What are you doing?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with both fear and desperation. "Sending the data to the surface," Cipher replied, her tone focused. "I've set up a relay to broadcast everything we've found to multiple locations across the globe. If they take us out, the information will go public. Every dirty secret, every name, every plan. They won't be able to hide." Jacob watched in awe as Cipher worked, her movements precise and calculated. But even as she typed, the sounds of their pursuers grew closer. They were running out of time. "How long will it take?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. "Not long," Cipher replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. "But we need to hold them off until it's done." Jacob nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. He grabbed an old pipe from the corner of the room, the cold metal heavy in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Minutes felt like hours as they waited, the tension in the room suffocating. Then, with a deafening crash, the door was blasted open, and their pursuers flooded into the room. Time seemed to slow as Jacob swung the pipe, the sound of metal hitting flesh ringing in his ears. Cipher fought alongside him, using every trick she knew to keep them at bay. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. Just as Jacob felt his strength failing, Cipher shouted, "It's done." She hit the final key on the terminal, and the screen flashed with a confirmation message. The data had been sent, there was no stopping it now. But their victory was short-lived. The armed men closed in, and Jacob felt a searing pain in his side as a bullet grazed him. He stumbled, his vision blurring, but before he could fall, Cipher was at his side, pulling him towards a small hatch in the floor. "We need to go," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. Chapter 7. The Revelation. Jacob clutched his side, the pain sharp and unrelenting as Cipher dragged him towards the hatch. The sounds of their pursuers closing in were almost drowned out by the pounding of his heart. Blood trickled down his side, soaking into his clothes, but he forced himself to stay conscious, to keep moving. Cipher yanked the hatch open, revealing a narrow tunnel beneath. "Get in," she commanded, her voice brooking no argument. Jacob didn't hesitate. He slid into the tunnel, his body screaming in protest as he landed hard on the cold ground below. Cipher followed, pulling the hatch closed behind them just as the armed men stormed into the room above. They were safe, at least for the moment. The tunnel was dark and cramped, barely wide enough for them to crawl through. Jacob's breaths came in ragged gasps as he fought to stay focused. "Can you move?" Cipher asked, her voice sharp and urgent. Jacob nodded, though the effort sent a wave of pain through his body. "Yeah," he rasped, forcing himself to crawl forward. The tunnel was tight, claustrophobic, but it was their only way out. Cipher led the way, moving quickly despite the confined space. Jacob followed, his mind racing. The data had been sent, but that didn't mean they were out of danger. Whoever was behind the conspiracy would stop at nothing to silence them. And even if they managed to escape, there was no guarantee that the world would believe what they had uncovered. Minutes passed in tense silence as they crawled through the tunnel, the darkness pressing in on them. Jacob's body screamed for rest, but he knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding through the underground labyrinth like a snake. Finally they reached the end, a rusted metal grate that led to the surface. Cipher pushed it open, and the cool night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the tunnel. They emerged into a narrow alley, the city streets quiet and deserted around them. Jacob collapsed against the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion. Cipher knelt beside him, quickly assessing his wound. "You're lucky," she said, her tone clinical. "It's a flesh wound, but you've lost a lot of blood. We need to get you to a safe place." Jacob nodded weakly, his vision swimming. The world seemed to tilt around him, but he fought to stay conscious. "Did it work?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cipher's expression softened, just a fraction. "It worked. The data is out there. It's only a matter of time before the world knows the truth." Jacob felt a surge of relief, though it was quickly tempered by the reality of their situation. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The people they were up against were powerful, ruthless, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. "We need to disappear," Cipher said, her voice taking on a new urgency. "They'll be looking for us, and they won't stop until they find us. We need to go underground, completely off the grid." Jacob nodded, his mind too foggy to argue. He trusted Cipher. She had gotten them this far, and he knew she would do whatever it took to keep them alive. With Cipher's help, Jacob struggled to his feet. The pain was intense, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. They had to keep moving to stay one step ahead of their enemies. The truth was out there, but the fight was far from over. As they disappeared into the night, Jacob couldn't help but wonder what the future held. The world had been on the brink of disaster, and though they had managed to avert the immediate threat, the forces they had uncovered would not go quietly. The dark web was vast, and the conspiracy they had exposed was just the beginning. But for now they had won a small victory, and that was enough.